but I think we're going to pass the torch on to Josh, who's covering the Stone Roses.
Yes, the Stone Roses. And in the opening montage, you heard Made of Stone. And now, all right, I alluded. Well, Matt, what are the numbers on Stone
you remember.
Roses?
Good, Josh.
Yeah.
All right, so Stone Roses' debut album, or self-titled album, might be their debut album.
It is their
too.
debut album.
There you go. Thank you. Comes in at number 5 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 3 in 1989, number 35 of all time. It is the Stone Roses' highest-rated album on Best Ever Albums. It comes in at number 319 in Rolling Stone, and the Stone Roses are ranked number 74 of overall artist rankings, a full 110 more than Tom Petty. So, wow.
Yeah, they only made 2 albums, guys. And,
and Tom Petty made a lot more than that.
We need a brief bio because you got Tom Petty and The Cure, so yeah.
Oh geez, I'll try and go fast. This is a band that I knew nothing about, and I always kind of heard them name checked, and they had a short career but a lasting impact on the music scene and British music at large as well. They originated in Manchester, England. First formed in 1984, so we've got 5 years of them performing in various iterations before this album was released. The members of the band in this album are Ian Brown on vocals, a guy named Manny on bass, Rennie on drums, and John Squire on guitar. Now those people kind of come in and out with other people that I'm going to talk about through leading up to this album. There's some kind of overlap and comings and goings across different bands and things like that, so I'll try and keep it as straight as possible. It is a little confusing. Ian Brown and John Squire met in grammar school and started a Clash-inspired band called The Patrol, along with Andy Cousins and Simon Wollstonecraft. That band fizzled out, and Wollstonecraft joined Johnny Marr and Andy Rourke in their pre-Smiths band Freak Party. So Smiths also from Manchester, if you recall, so there's overlap there. Then Squire and Cousins started a new band called the Fireside Chaps and later changed their name to the Waterfront. And this is when Gary Manny Moundfield joins the picture, and along with drummer Chris Goodwin and singer David Carty. Those guys would be short-lived as well, and Ian Brown joins this band briefly, but then the Waterfront ends in 1983 as a band. Then in 83, Andy Cousins comes back and said, I'm going to start another band, and with Ian Brown this time. And then Wollstonecraft comes back into the picture as the drummer after turning down the job as the drummer of the Smiths. So a big mistake maybe on his part. I don't know. And then Pete Garner comes in, a guy named Pete Garner comes in on bass, who was back in the Patrol, that very first band I mentioned, and as well as John Squire. So there's kind of a lot of overlapping people at various times. This is the group that became the Stone Roses, and that's when they used their name. They rehearsed for 6 months, and then they performed their first show on May 1984. And then Wollstonecraft left the band, and then Rennie Wren came in May of 1984 as well. They recorded a demo in August of 84 and played their first gig as the Stone Roses. I said that incorrectly. They performed their first gig as Stone Roses on October 23rd, 1984, opening for Pete Townsend at an anti-heroin concert. So I guess heroin was a big deal.
An anti-heroin concert?
Yeah.
I support that cause.
In 85, March of 85, they recorded their first single, double A-side, So Young and Tell Me. They started to build a following in Manchester, and then they went into the studio in August of 85 to record their debut album, but were unhappy with the results. So it was shelved. And then they notoriously, due to their frustration with lack of attention in the Manchester scene, Brown and Rennie started spray painting the name of the band around the city and got negative attention that way. They brought on Gareth Evans as a manager, and then, as this always works out, Brian Brown and Squire started to write more songs, and so they thought they should start getting more money than the other band members. And so then Cousins and Wren left the band in protest, with both eventually returning. So at this point, however, Cousins was pushed out of the band by Gareth Evans, the manager, in May of '86. And then in December of '86, they recorded their first demo as a 4-piece. So with the first recordings of Sugar Spun Sister and Elephant Stone. Elephant Stone was a single that was released before this album came out. We're still doing singles in the UK that weren't on albums, by the way, for this, at least for this band. If you've lost track of who's in the band, don't worry. It's not that important. Pete Garner leaves in June of '87. And this is when Manny became the permanent replacement, solidifying the lineup you hear on this debut album. So just to recap, it's Ian Brown and Manny on bass, Rennie on drums, and John Squire on guitar. And then at the end of '87, they released their second single, Sally Cinnamon, which is a good song. This is a band that I not only listened to their debut album, but kind of a lot of the singles around that, because they kind of capture also kind of the essence of the band. In May of '88, they play a show at the International 2, which is kind of like a warehouse club in Manchester, to raise funds for a campaign against Clause 28, which was a series of British laws that prohibited, quote, the promotion of homosexuality. In the audience of that show was none other than 16-year-old Liam Gallagher, and that concert is what he said served as his inspiration to start a band. So the Stone Roses have a direct lineage to Britpop at large and Oasis. There'd be no Oasis without the Stone Roses, is what I'm saying. Noel Gallagher has also said that he was inspired by the Stone Roses at another gig. So I don't know if he just rode that coattails of that quote or what, but that is in the record. They were signed to a label finally, Zomba Records, but then transferred to a subsidiary called Silvertone Records, which would later come into a lawsuit, as often happens with these bands. They were signed to an 8-album deal, which seems like a lot of albums to me, but what do I know? I only do a podcast about music. In '88 and early '89, they recorded their debut album across 3 different studios, produced by John Leckie. They released that single Elephant Stone that I mentioned earlier in October of '88, but it made little impact. In Made of Stone, the song that's in the montage, received more attention and got played on the radio, but only peaked at 90 on the UK singles charts. After the album was released in May of '89, the album hit number 32 on the UK albums chart, and the single She Bangs the Drums gave them a top 40 UK hit and number 1 on the UK independent chart. They started getting attention, selling out more shows, and then later in '89, they released the double single Fool's Gold / What the World Is, which reached number 8 on the UK singles chart, and that was their first top 10 single. Did you guys listen to Fool's Gold? It's kind of tacked on to another release, a later release of the debut album, but it wasn't on the original.
I thought it was. Okay.
Original release in the UK and US. So, but yeah, it's on Amazon. I'm sure it's on Spotify as part of the album. So, yeah. Good to know. And then Fool's Gold quickly became their famous song, and they performed it on Top of the Pops, and that gave them their first top 10 hit, and the album rose to 19 on the charts as early as 1990. So, side note, the band and the album helped invent the Manchester scene in Manchester, so Manchester, MAD, which is defined as a fusion of rock and like acid house music and psychedelia and 60s pop. Some of that I'm sure you heard in this album. Other bands like the Happy Mondays and the Charlatans and James are also associated with the scene. The Stone Roses are also considered part of like quote unquote baggy culture and fashion, and so that is baggy jeans often flared alongside brightly colored tie-dye tops and general 60s style. First in
And
Manchester.
we've been talking about like British subculture since all the way
Yes.
back in the mid '60s with the
Yes,
mods
mods.
and the greasers or the you know
Yep.
so
Yeah, and that
skins.
the look was capped off with a fishing hat that was kind of that bucket hat style that was supported by the Stone Roses drummer Rennie. So if you imagine it as kind of like part rave, part retro, part hippie, part soccer / football casual, that's kind of what the baggy style was. However, it was like all
There
these...
isn't really an American equivalent to this,
No,
is there?
no.
Like in like Caucasian subcultures. I'm trying to think like
No, and
No,
rave culture
yeah.
was kind of so much bigger overall, I think, in the UK than
oh
here.
god, if you look at
Yeah.
like the charts in the 90s, like half of the songs are techno songs I've never heard of in my
Right.
life. You know,
I
there's
think that-
some that crossed over, but like for every one that came to America, there's like 8 that was
Yep.
in the British charts.
And I think that plays into like trip hop too and electronica and stuff like that. This style was later eclipsed by grunge and Britpop in general, so it was kind of a short-lived thing, just like the band actually. The cover of the album is by John Squire. So he did, the guitarist did the cover of the album. It was Jackson Pollock inspired piece titled Bye Bye Bagman, which is a song on this album. And I have some wrap up after that, but that's kind of where we are at this point. Overall, to recap, they were a lot of members. They played for a while, a number of years in Manchester, released some singles, and then finally put out a debut album. So I didn't have any expectations of Stone Roses, or, well, not much. But what did you guys think of this album and the band, the Stone Roses? How about you, Matt? You go first.
Actually, I knew this record going into this week.
Okay.
And the reason I knew it was because, oddly enough, there was another podcast that I think it was a comedian did it. It was called The 500, and he was essentially the previous, not the most recent, not the 2020 version, but the one before that, the Rolling Stone Top 500 albums. So he went through that list, and he did one album an episode. So he's probably still doing it, and he always had a guest come on. That liked the band or whatever. So for this record, it was Jim Jeffries, the Australian comic, was talking about the Stone Roses. So I listened to that episode. It was ranked pretty high. It was or pretty low, I should say, on that. It was like 498. So it was one of the first episodes. Mm-hmm. But the way they were talking about it, I was like, I got to listen to this record, and like that inspired me to listen to it. And I loved it then. I love it now. It's like all this. It's got all the stuff that I kind of love. It's just like it's just like incorporating a lot of that. Like that '60s pop, the psychedelia, which I've liked. It's got a little bit more. There's a little bit more of that modern Britpop sound. Very melodic. Great production. It's like this. It's kind of this lo-fi, distorted yet crisp and clean. It's somehow like walking that fine line of being like this really distorted kind of like messy production, but also being very clean as well. It's kind of really interesting. It's anthemic at times, like very echoey, reverb. That stuff's all kind of slathered throughout this, but underneath it all are just great songwriting, and it's like one of those, and it gets almost better as it goes along. Like it starts off pretty good with this kind of like druggy, hypnotizing, I want to be adored, and then goes into more of the, she bangs the drums. I didn't hear that. Well, that was, I want to hear like Elephant Stone or some of these other songs that weren't on the edition that I listened to, but Waterfall's just a really pretty kind of walking, guitar part that's just, that's kind of little hypnotic, and then it goes into like Don't Stop, which is basically like a messed up version of Waterfall. It reminded me of Animal Collective and the stuff that they did. If you guys know them, but I think John does. I don't know if you do, Josh. We're definitely covering them
a little bit.
But it's got this kind of, it's like a very kind of, it's like a messy kind of, there's lots of stuff happening, the kind of all over the place. It's psychedelia, but in some ways it fits together. So I heard that, this time around going, man, that definitely sounds like some Animal Collective stuff there. But once, and I like Bye Bye Bad Man, but once you get to like Elizabeth, or not, and Elizabeth My Dear is basically Scarborough Fair.
Yeah,
It's like,
yes.
it's like a little, minute long Scarborough Fair. But then you get like Song for My Sugar Spun Sister, Made of Stone, Shoot You Down, This Is the One, I Am the Resurrection. It's a murderer's row of excellent songs. And it's just like, and I love it when albums do that. They start off really solid, and then they wait they wait for the second half to really kick it into high gear, and it's just like it makes it for a great listening experience. I didn't know that Fool's Gold wasn't on the original. I just listened to the record, so and it's funny it's actually kind of apropos that it wasn't on the original release, because my one knock on this record was that song goes too long. It's like I get the point. It's a very funky, kind of dance kind of groove that it's going on, but it's like almost 10 minutes long, and it can be half that length and still be effective, but it's actually not I shouldn't have listened to it by my own criteria, because I'm only listening to like the true album version. But I still like that song as well. But yeah, man, it's hitting on all cylinders for me. It's just great production, the melody very catchy, interesting, different sounds, all that. It's just scratching so many itches for me. So yeah, big thumbs up on the Stone Roses record here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I kept listening to this one, guys. Like I pulled a Matt on this one. I listened to this and I said, that's pretty good, but I didn't feel I'd cracked the code yet. And then I listened to it a second time, and I said, that's pretty good, but I haven't cracked the code yet. And then I listened to it a third time, and you know what my take was, guys? It's pretty good. And it just didn't get above it for me.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it. It just, and that's not to say it's bad, but I had the Matt thing that you've talked about, Matt, where it's like, this album is considered a top 10 album of the 80s. There must be something I'm missing. There must be an element of this that isn't just... I described this album in my notes. I was writing it down. I said, this is a collage of things that we've heard throughout the 80s mixed with things that are coming in the 90s. Like, there's songs that sound a lot like Britpop in the 90s, especially Pulp. I mean, the song for My Sugar Spun Sister could be a Pulp song, to the point where I'm like, I can't believe this isn't a Pulp song in some ways. And certainly elements, we haven't done a ton with Brit rock yet, and Britpop, and I know a lot of people would say that Oasis is who we got biggest, right, in the US, and that in some ways they are and aren't a part of that movement. But definitely that they're brethren of the era, like James, right, that you mentioned, like that song Laid and stuff like that, for sure. Could hear that immediately in the Happy Mondays. In there was elements of Jesus and the Mary Chain in here. There were certainly elements of the Smiths and sort of the goth rock we listened to. And it was as if I was building a collage of different stuff. And a lot of the stuff I really like or is good sounds for me. So nothing about that was bad. But as I got to the nearly 10-minute funk at the end, which was enjoyable, but also like, do I need 10 minutes of funk in this album? My take always as I got to Fool's Gold was I was like, that's going to be the 12th track again, and I'm going to have the same take on this again. And I think that was my lasting take, and that's why I was curious to hear what you guys thought. And I wrote down, Matt will really like this album, and I get the feeling Josh might feel the same way I do about this album as I do, but we'll see. I'll be curious to hear. And so that's why I was really happy Matt had the first take, because I was like, I want to hear from Matt what about the album stood out. But it wasn't that you were inarticulate, Matt, but kind of what you said is you're like, I like the way this album sounds. And I was like, well, there's elements I like how this album sounds too, but what else? What else pushes this, transcends this? And maybe, Matt, you can give me added context in that, or maybe I'll punt to Josh. I think I kind of want to hear Josh's take, because then I want to circle back around and talk about this in context as well. So I would say this is a slight thumbs up for me. I was not left baffled, but I was left a little bit bemused. Like, bemused is probably I was left a little bit confused, I would say, as to what it was about this album that rose it up to the top 10, because there's albums that I may not like, but I completely understand why they are. It's very rare I hear an album and I'm like, I don't understand why people were moved by this, even for albums that I really sometimes don't even like, right? I think this one and Astral Weeks fall into the category of like, I don't know what it is, but there's just something missing from how other people hear it than what I'm hearing. And it's rare that I don't sort of line up with the albums that are considered there. I mean, the rest of the 80s, if you wrote a list of rock albums, right? Murmur, Daydream Nation, Doolittle, I'm like, yes, 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 I get all of My Bloody Valentine, right? Which Josh didn't like. Yes, get it. You know, all these different albums. This is the only one I think that's in that sort of higher strata where it doesn't raise to that for me. So what do you think, Josh?
Well, I think part of it, I can understand your position. I think I felt that way initially. But the more I listened to this album, the more I liked it. And then it started just becoming the album that I kept coming back to when I wasn't listening to the other albums for the show. I just kept picking tracks out, and then I was listening to parts of the songs. And I think so for me, I really like this album. I think it's, is it a top 10 album in the 80s? I don't know, but I think what it does, like Matt says, it does really well. I feel like it captures the all of the kind of like parts of the 60s British rock sound that I liked, mixed with like kind of the best parts of the psychedelia that I liked, and then kind of has some of this like proto Britpop sound to it, which is essentially like, you know, kind of retro 60s British rock anyway. I think so I think, I don't know if you felt this way, but like maybe its reputation, I think, has grown after the band was done. And like kind of retrospectively, people are like, it's the best British album ever. It's like blah, blah, blah. And like all these like NME ranks it like the best album ever or something like that. I don't know if that kind of colored or at least messed with your expectations. I can totally understand if it did.
I don't know, because I didn't dislike it. It just, but I can't help but think I fell into the Matt trap a little bit, where I did view it a little bit, you know, in the knowing it was an A paper. When I thought it was a B+ paper. Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think for me, what really works on this album are the melodies, the guitar parts, and kind of how it really reminds me of like the Kinks and like the Byrds and kind of like the best like pop elements of those bands. There's a slight Britishness to this band that I really like, and I kind of like the sound of the guitars and kind of how washed out it is in some respects. You know, there's no kind of like stuff that doesn't work for me, like noise rock and kind of the distortion. There's none of that there, but there is kind of like a almost muddy quality to some of this sound. And ultimately, I think it's just, I don't know, it's just like the hooks and the pop kind of nature of this that really worked on me. I don't get kind of, you know, doing the bio, I don't kind of get the acid house type of fusion of that. I saw references to kind of like the rhythm section capturing this beat that is reminiscent of that genre, but I guess Fool's Gold 2 is kind of like a dance track, so I guess that is where kind of that fusion lies. I don't really kind of get that like Manchester baggy culture. I don't know those other bands either that you seem to be familiar with, like James and stuff, so maybe that will be more sense if I listen to them. But yeah, I think this is just for me like a really good pop album, and it's not too, and it doesn't really sound like anything. It sounds more like, you know, future, you know, Oasis and Pulp and other Britpop bands than it does of like 80. You know, there's no synth in here. It's just kind of the 4-piece stuff, and it doesn't sound like REM either in some ways. So, you know,
outside of the jangle guitars, that's about the only thing they share in common.
So I don't know. It's kind of got this laid back vibe that worked for me, mixed with the pop rock, and I'm doing a bad job of describing why I liked it, but it really just got under my skin, and then I just started like every song, like Matt said, was like, oh yeah, this is good, this is good. This is the one they play at the Manchester United games, apparently. That's like an anthem for them, and I just found myself like every song liking. And like Matt said, it was the fact that in fact, the first time I listened to it, I heard I Want to Be Adored, and I was like, what is this? It's kind of like shoegazy. I didn't really like it. It was the most popular song on the, like the rankings for Amazon Music. And I was like, well, okay, I don't like this. But then like, it just,
which is funny because that's by far my favorite track on the album.
That's so weird. Yeah. Like that's the song I like the least, but like everything else is like solid gold for me. So,
I honestly, I heard I Want to Be Adored, and it was the opposite of the Fool's Gold thing. Every time it fooled me, literally, Fool's Gold. I think for me, you mentioned the washed out sound, which is a really good description. I think I don't want pop music with washed out sounds. I want it to be ethereal and less freeform. And I think that was a little bit of my problem. Like, this is not, I don't want this sound with like trying to write songs that kind of sound as much like Big Star as they sound like, shoegaze, like you mentioned. It's kind of was almost the inverse of the Galaxy 500 album, which I know you hated, but I loved, where it was like the Galaxy 500, just they ran with the vibe, right? And I'm like, the vibe check is not right here, because the vibe should feel different for me, for my style, with that thing, and then the glimmering pop comes in, and it was just it was a little bit of a mismatch for me stylistically. It was like by themselves parts that I like, but put together it just rose to like there's very good songs like Made of Stone, and as I mentioned, I Love I Want to Be Adored is a really good song. She Bangs the Drums is a song I liked quite a bit. Shoot You Down. So it's not like there's not songs I don't like, but there wasn't anything like on this album that rose to the level that the shoegazy washed out albums I really love had, or the pop albums I love had. So I think that might have been what it is.
Yeah, I get that. I think it's kind of like, for you, this album takes aspects of other things you like but doesn't work as well. Like you said, the collage aspect. I think the collage just
it's
proportions
not like
are wrong or something.
It's not like a peanut butter and pickles sandwich, but it's like a peanut butter and something else sandwich, right?
Yeah.
That's not exactly how I think two things should go together, and it doesn't taste bad to me, but it's like I'd much rather have like peanut butter and banana, or peanut butter and chocolate, or something. That's I think kind of how I'd describe it. Yeah.
See, it's interesting because all those reasons why you don't like it are reasons why I do like it. Because
that's why I knew you'd like it. Yeah, because it's got melody and it's got all.
But
the stuff
I like the melody juxtaposed with the kind of the unique production. The like I said, it's got this weird, amalgam of like this. It's kind of like edgy, distorted, production. But
you
it's
think
also,
this is edgy? See, I didn't find this album edgy
a
at
little
all.
bit. I mean, yeah, and in a sense, because it's not edgy in the sense that like there's the distortion, there's the echoey, there's the. It's not crisp production in the traditional sense, but it's also. It's
I would
also
say
very
even in the non-traditional sense, this is, I wouldn't say, a crisply produced album. Would
no,
you?
but it's in a weird way, it's not crisp. No, that's not the right word. But it's sometimes I guess I feel like production that's not crisp, or that's like that's an edgier thing is a little bit more by nature almost sometimes can be more off-putting or can be harder to digest. Whereas you're getting some of that here, but it's also, for me, it was really easy to digest because it was just so melodic. It was so, there's some great drum beats in here. There's plenty of things to hang the hat on. It's just that the old story with me with like, give me something that's got at the foundation a really good melody or a really good beat, and then put some quirkiness or some production aspects to it.
Oh yeah, I get it.
That make it like its unique thing. And while they are a collage of all these different sounds, past and future. It's also a very distinct sound that's kind of their own.
Agreed.
Right? Like, and so I love all of that to make it a unique album for a band that really was just around for this and one other record. Yes, it probably does. Is it the fifth best album of the decade? Probably not. I think that's probably a little.
Yeah.
Are they the whatever? What did they say? It was the
74, right?
the 74th best band of all time? No, that's kind of, I think you probably need more than two, unless you're Nirvana, right? You probably need more than 2 records to get that status. However, I think this is just a great record, and it's anthemic. Like, that's the other thing too. This would be a great thing to see performed live, really, to get people going. And it's just, like I said, it's just checking off a lot of boxes for me. So I like the kind of the unique mismatch nature of it, because I don't think it's mismatching in a negative way. But I get what you're saying, and there's something, and I totally understand, and I understand that feeling of like, what is it that I'm getting? Now, the Astro Weeks comparison's a little like that one. I really don't get.
I'm not comparing this in sound to Astral Weeks.
But your reaction to like how it's so revered.
No. I like this album way more than I liked Astral Weeks.
Okay.
I'm saying that, like, in terms of albums that are definitively always listed in top 10 lists, that's the only other album I can think of that is as much a miss. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
So that's where,
Yeah.
So it makes sense, though, when I think about it. Like, I think about, I knew you would like this because of all the things you just said, Matt. And it makes sense with me that Josh would like it because it takes out all of the things that you have not liked in the decade, which are, I think, the things that I do like in this style. So it's funny. It's like, by taking them out, it's like, it did crack the code for you. Like, oh, this sound and vibe can be a version I like. And for me, I think it's sort of like, it's missing some of the stuff that really gives it the heft to it. So it is on brand for all of us the more I think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I agree. It's probably, if it's the 5th highest rated album of the 80s or whatever, that's a little bit overrated in my opinion.
Yeah, probably. There's
solid.
probably like the thing, like everybody's kind of coming back and being like, wow, and like rediscover, which is great. Go rediscover albums. But like, does it mean it's that good?
Well, it's my third favorite album tonight, so that should give you an idea of like kind of how.
All right, good stuff.
That's probably. Go ahead.
Final
Sorry.
thoughts? Any final thoughts on the band? No.
And I know I spent a lot of time being the contrary voice, but I'd like to say this is a very solid album. So when I say that, please know that I still give this pretty comfortable thumbs up.
Oh, but I get that though, because it's like, you're like, oh, it's going to be really good, number 5 of the day, and then you're like left a little nonplussed. It's kind of like, wow, and I understand that reaction totally. So
So after this, just to wrap up, they had a 1990 outdoor concert at Spike Island in Widnes, England, which is attended by 27,000 people and featured other like DJs and bands as well. And it's despite sound problems and bad organizations, often became known as the Woodstock of the baggy generation. So it's very influential. The only other artist I recognized at that concert was Paul Oakenfold, who's like a DJ. So that's kind of, I guess, in line with the house rave scene that was going on. They then had their final single was called One Love in July of 90. That was their last original release for 4 years as they entered a protracted legal battle to terminate their contract with Silvertone. And then the parent label, Zomba, took out an injunction so the band couldn't record anywhere else. But then in May of 91, the court sided with the band, and the Stone Roses then signed with Geffen and began work on a second album. But the Silvertone ruling, they appealed the ruling and delayed their album for another year. So the album Second Coming, what didn't end up coming out until December 5th, 1994. They spent 347 10-hour days working on the album at one point. And that album, based on the one song I heard, sounds very different than this album. And it's like, it goes straight up into like blues rock, like heavy blues rock sound. And that's what the overall album is described as well. And they received mixed reviews. And then the band slowly started to kind of come apart, and members left, and they canceled some big gigs, or announced a comeback tour, but then that was canceled. They played, and so they kind of dissolved the group in October of 96. There was some brief reuniting in the mid-2000s. They played at some concerts like Coachella in April 2013, and in London and Glasgow and Manchester. and actually released a couple singles as well in 2016 and two there. But then ultimately in 2019, John Squire said in an interview with The Guardian that the band had disbanded. So it's kind of a rare instance of a band not getting back together. And with only 2 albums, I guess it's not much to draw on or something. But it seems like, this band is beloved in some ways, in some circles. But yeah, short-lived, short but sweet, influential. And two of the three of us liked the album a lot, and one of us sort of liked the album. So that's it for the Stone Roses. We're not covering the second album, and
nope, that was ranked 334 in the 1990s.
Yeah, so there we go.
Best ever albums.